So our first speaker for today is Vikki Hawkins. Vikki has been a curator at Imperial War Museum since 2016. She previously delivered Wounded, Conflict, Casualties and Care, an exhibition at the Science Museum which drew on First World War medical collections. In her current role creating IWM's new Second World War galleries, Vikki focuses on the history of Asia and the Pacific, the British Empire and the home front. She's contributed to various conferences on the topic of displaying marginalised history in museums and is currently developing a research project on material culture of sexual violence in conflict. The title of Vikki's paper today is Curating a Transnational Narrative in Imperial War Museum's new Second World War Galleries. Thank you, Vikki, sorry.
Thank you very much for that introduction, David, and hello, everybody. I'm really pleased to be able to speak to you today on the topic of curating conflicts at the Imperial War Museum. As David said, I've been a curator at IWM for the past 4.5 years, and in that time I've been focusing on the redevelopment of IWM's permanent Second World War galleries. They were due to open in March 2021, but due to delays caused by COVID and the closure of the museum for several months last year, they are now scheduled to open to the public in October 2021. So fingers crossed that that will still go ahead for that date. I'm going to just share my screen with you now. Here we go. So the last large-scale Second World War galleries opened in IWM in the late 80s, early 90s. And after about 20 years, they were replaced with an interim display of some of our key large objects related to the war until the new galleries that I'm developing and building were ready to get started. Now, the key to this redevelopment is to reposition IWM's traditional remit of Britain and the Empire within a wider global context. The aim is to broaden our focus to include the millions of people from all sides who are embroiled in this conflict. This will allow for understanding of the experiences of a wider range of people and may consequently engage non-British and international visitors who have historically felt excluded from the singular interpretation of the British experience in war. Now, the Second World War narrative, as reflected in IWM's galleries of the 90s, drew out events that lay closest to home for Britain and the Commonwealth. So the proportion of the showcases and objects dedicated to the Blitz and the Battle of Britain was about the same as the total and entire campaign in the Pacific or the war on the Eastern Front. Visitors would have fairly concluded that within the strategic balance of war, these events carried the same weight or affected a comparable number of lives. Also present was an overwhelmingly positive view of Britain's resilience throughout the war years, perpetuating the myth that Britain stood alone in the face of Nazi Germany, when in fact it had the resources of a global empire to call upon. Stories of the British home front dominated the narrative, both because of its enduring popular appeal with IWM's visitors, but also because of the strength of IWM's collection in this area. This British-centric view of the Second World War has created an imbalance in the cultural material and memory held by IWM. It has also prevented IWM from providing visitors with a comprehensive and critically rigorous analysis and explanation of the war, especially some of Britain's less triumphant episodes or strategically important events in which Britain was not directly involved. If you visited IWM in the 90s, you might recognise these images on the screen of IWM's Blitz experience. Visitors were encouraged to walk through the rubble of London with the sounds of air raid sirens overhead and the occasional yell from an ARP warden with a questionable Cockney accent demanding that you put that light out. This experience was extremely popular with visitors, and honestly, 20 years after it was removed, I can guarantee that as I walk through the gallery spaces, I will be asked where it can be found. But IWM eventually removed the display because it was felt that it was wrong to replicate war in this way. Instead, they began to focus on the real life experiences of individuals who lived during the Blitz, which still included that sort of laughter and spirit of togetherness, which was so popular within the experience, but also gives us a space to include stories of pain and suffering and loss. This focus on the individual reflects a wider museum move away from collecting objects of type to acquiring material that has provenance, a story, an associated moment, person, time, and place. Throughout the galleries, we interpret objects, drawing out stories of people who used, collected, treasured, lost, or broke these items. Interpreting material culture also enables us to open up a dialogue to highlight and discuss transnational histories. We do this throughout the gallery displays to discuss experiences of recruitment, civilian mobilization, mass manufacture, famine, sexual violence, all in international contexts. Today, I'm going to focus on the theme of civilian bombing to show you how this theory can be put into practice. I mentioned that IWM has a strong collection in this area of the British home front, and it ranges from full-size Morrison and Anderson shelters, civil defence uniform and equipment, personal diaries describing the effects of bombing raids, evacuation, rationing, and that literally only touches the surface. Many of our traditional audiences are familiar with such items, possibly because they saw objects like these in their homes when they grew up. They may have heard stories about objects being used, seen them in TV documentaries or films, or possibly learnt about them in school. These are recognisable, even mundane objects, but they have the capacity to invoke memory, carry embodied meaning, and encourage intergenerational discussions between visitors and audience participation, which is vital in the process of making meaning and sharing knowledge. In order to encourage the same level of engagement with IWM's international narrative, we have deliberately tried to establish parallels between the British experience and those of other countries. This can be achieved in several ways. First, by the stories of the individual. On the screen are three men who all experienced the effects of bombing on their homes. George is originally from Trinidad and served in the Middlesex Regiment during the First World War, after which he settled in Southwark in London. When the Second World War broke out, George was too old to join up again, so instead became an auxiliary firefighter on the home front. George also co-founded the Fire Service's education group for firemen and appeared on radio shows, in magazines, and talked on the radio about the contribution of West Indian servicemen and women. The second man, Dr. Razug Shirabi, was a doctor living in Nagasaki. Razug was at his desk in the Nagasaki Medical College when the atomic bomb hit. His 16-year-old son was trapped in a lecture theatre nearby, which burnt to the ground. His eldest son was sort of stumbled home from his job at the arms factory, but succumbed to radiation poisoning and died. Razug, also suffering from radiation sickness himself, continued to treat survivors. Throughout this time, he compiled detailed medical notes on the effects of the atomic blast, which was used by doctors around the world. Finally, Dieter Claassen was 16 years old when this photo was taken. He lived in Essen, an industrial town in Germany that was heavily bombed by Allied air forces. Following particularly heavy raids, he was ordered by local authorities to attach a cart to the back of his motorbike and collect the dead and wounded bodies of his neighbours, driving them to the local hospital. All three of these men had very different experiences of bombing. But within these stories, and so many more that feature within the galleries, we see the repetition of themes of shock of destruction, the fear of bombing itself, the sadness felt when losing loved ones, and the new roles that people had to take on to support the war effort. An understanding of the effects of bombing on civilians can also be established through highlighting similarities in material culture. On the screen, you can see the shelter administration ticket from Chongqing, China's wartime capital, posters warning people to observe a blackout in Germany, images of Indian women volunteering as air raid wardens, and a flag which indicates the location of an emergency water supply in Japan. These comparisons are not intended as a way of suggesting that all countries and all cultures experienced war in the same way, but to build effective connection and moments of identification across international boundaries. It may inspire historical empathy, but most critically, the combination of these two will acknowledge that although we share the history and the material culture of the Second World War, the individual experiences of it were diverse. In practical terms, achieving a more balanced display of transnational objects and personal stories has been a challenge. Collecting objects of any kind requires an element of trust in the institution, trust that the objects will be cared for and the stories sensitively told. Whereas many British people have heard of IWM or appreciate that it tries to tell a social history of war, it is much harder to explain this to people or institutions in other countries. Only this week, I actually spoke to a sound archive in Japan about licensing a patriotic march, some music. We explained that the music would be displayed alongside a uniform of a Japanese army soldier and also an interactive map showing the success of the Japanese military campaign between 1941 and 1943. The archive was intrigued as to why we wanted to include this content. And I'm sure there was an element of wariness about how IWM, as a British institution, would describe the Japanese people and their history. Luckily, I have the invaluable support of several contacts in Japan who have visited me and IWM and are able to talk about our intentions for these galleries on our behalf to the many Japanese families who have kindly donated stories for the collection. But it's not just countries which were Britain's enemy during the war years that require some convincing. The imperial in our institution's name leads many British people to believe that stories of their ancestors will not be displayed within our walls. If the intention of these galleries is to put the British experience of war into a wider global context, then we also need to take a closer look and more critical look at exactly what a British narrative of war includes. In 1940, after the fall of France, the perpetual myth is that Britain stood alone against Nazi Germany, when in fact it depended on the resources of over 80 countries of its empire to continue fighting. Britain needed natural resources and materials, production facilities, food, money and manpower for civil defence and the armed services, which it received with varying degrees of voluntary support and exploitation. These are transnational stories which are essential to understanding how Britain fought the war. As part of the wider outreach and engagement activities at IWM, we spoke to visitors about the transnational nature of the conflict and specifically what they knew about the complexities of the British Empire. Most participants were keen to learn more and called for IWM to be bold and explain the history of the British Empire in a critical and truthful way. Overall, people wanted to see themselves in the galleries, to feel included and represented, and to learn more about the experiences of people from across the globe. In response to this, we considered the ways in which we would be able to increase the presence of the British Empire within the narrative and the physical space. It should be noted that the galleries that we're building at the moment will be entirely contemporaneous, so that only objects from the time will be included to avoid any teleological certainty. Therefore, many of IWM's rich oral histories from veterans or memoirs written after the event will not be included. Museums can acquire and borrow material from other countries, and although this often comes at a considerable cost, in this ever-changing COVID world, it's proved even more difficult. There is also the issue that the collections that IWM does hold related to people who resided within the British Empire are not always created by or reflective of the people themselves. IWM's photograph, film and library collections do contain some of the diversity we were looking for, however. I just wanted to share a couple of examples for you because they're particularly nice ones. So here we have a group of West Indian women recruited to join the ATS, the Auxiliary Territorial Service, as they wait for transport to take them to their training camp in November 1943. Here is a group of women from Botswana knitting clothes for the Navy League. And finally, Indian women labourers engaged in airfield construction work, past mechanics working on a Royal Air Force bomber base in Bengal in 1944. These photos are often taken by official war photographers, whose gaze is not always sympathetic or even aware of their subject. The people within these photographs are talked about, but not talked to. We do not know more about their experiences, their motivations, or their opinions towards war and Britain. There were aspirations to include diaries, contemporaneous first-hand accounts, quotes, for example, of people from across the globe who contributed to the war effort. However, this is also a very Western approach to understanding how stories and memories are recorded. For example, When looking at the experience of Indian and Chinese labourers who built the Lado Road supply route from India to China, who were provisioned with little more than basic pickaxes and suffered long, hard days of manual work with barely any food and basic medical supplies, it is highly unlikely that these people would have kept a diary of their experiences. Many were illiterate, and if those that were literate would have used their wages to prioritise food, shelter, and safety over pen and paper. However, their experience should not be marginalised or excluded because of this. Therefore, in some areas of the galleries, we have actually broken down the barrier between curator and visitor and tried to explain why the material is not always there, or address the gaze of the photographer in order to challenge visitors to think more critically about the way that we use material evidence, or the lack of it, to tell history. Although taking a substantially more balanced and global approach to the narrative and physical pacing of the gallery, IWM is aware that it will not be able to include many of the underrepresented or marginalised histories that would be needed to address a full transnational telling of the experiences of the Second World War. But by highlighting global patterns and themes across the conflict, particularly through the interpretive framework of parallels between countries, including a diverse range of individual experiences, and critically examining what it means to tell a British narrative of a transnational conflict, IWM will provide visitors with an accessible platform to engage with aspects of history that might have been previously marginalised, hidden, or unknown to them. As a national museum, IWM's galleries need to be relevant to 21st century visitors who are part of a progressive international community. Its narrative, the objects it displays, and the personal stories it tells need to be more diverse and more global. The new Second World War galleries will be a permanent fixture at IWM for the next 2 decades, and by adopting a more transnational narrative, their legacy will be to uphold IWM's mission statement, which is to communicate a deeper understanding about how our global society was and is affected by the causes, course, and consequences of war. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Vicki, for that fascinating insight into the work that you're doing at IWM, both from a sort of a theoretical perspective, but also in really valuable insights into the methodological problems and the practical problems of putting together an exhibit of that kind. I'm sure there will be lots of fascinating questions from our audience, and audience do please feel free to start adding those questions to the Q&A as we go along. But for now, we will move on to our next speaker, who is Eleanor Rowley. Eleanor is a doctoral candidate in the Department of Politics, Languages and International Studies of Bath. And her thesis examines how young people respond to the complex dynamics of memory in heritage education settings, with a focus on school field trips from England to site-based war museums at the Western Front. Today, however, she's going to be talking to us about war museums at the Western Front, and her talk is called Archetypes and Individuals, Comparing the Representation of Transnational Perspectives in 2 Western Front War Museums. Thank you very much, Eleanor.
Thank you, David. I'm just going to share my screen before I begin. I hope everyone can hear me. Just bear with me a moment. Sorry about this. Okay, sorry about this. I'll try again. Okay, hopefully you can see that. I'm afraid I had to switch computers at the last minute, so I'm a little bit less. I hope this is the latest version of my PowerPoint. Okay, so thank you for that introduction, David, and it's a privilege to follow Vicki from that really interesting talk. So today I want to talk about two museums at the Western Front, the Historial of the Great War and in Flanders Fields Museum. In Flanders Fields, of course, is in Ypres in Belgium, and the Historial is at the Somme in France. So these are two site-based First World War museums, and they were both opened within 6 years of each other in the 1990s. They've both been recently renewed and refurbished in time for the centenary, but in both cases, the museum's directors today have reflected or confirmed that to a large extent their current mission today is consistent with that at the time of the museum's founding in the 1990s. So the first thing I want to emphasize is that the origins of both these museums and the principles that continue to drive their discourse belong to an important watershed in the memory of the First World War, and that is the passing of the generation who experienced the conflict firsthand. So this new wave of, if you like, musealization of the conflict heralded by these two museums can be understood as a response to the unavoidable demise of what Assmann calls communicative memory. And at the same time, it's an attempt to give concrete form to cultural memory. And of course, it was at a time of quite a lot of optimism about closer collaboration in Europe with the Maastricht Treaty and so on. So my talk today will take you through a necessarily brief overview of the discourse and museography of the two museums. And basically I want to look at the contrasting ways in which they broadcast what is essentially quite a similar transnational cosmopolitan message, but they do it in very different ways. So starting with the Historial, this museum has been critically acclaimed for reimagining the form and function of a war museum. I won't go into the origins too much, but what's most interesting, I think, for our purposes today, is that although it's very much a local museum, it was set up by and is still financed by and run by the local departmental council in cooperation with an association established for the museum. So although it's very much a local museum, it has a really ambitious vision behind it. And that's because the local officials wanted to really highlight the international nature of the Somme as a historical site and the Battle of the Somme, which of course was such an international battle with huge significance for memory communities worldwide. Despite the large number of war graves, like Commonwealth war graves, German and French war graves and memorials and so on at the Somme, there was no museum there by the 1990s. In France, the memory of the First World War is very much dominated, especially at this time, by Verdun, and the Somme was largely neglected despite the area, suffering such an impact. So the local team there wanted to remind the rest of France, not least, of what had happened there and how internationally significant it was. So with this interest in the scale and the transnational nature of the events, it was considered necessary to incorporate a range of perspectives into the museum and in the drafting of the museum's narrative. And a small team of international historians were therefore brought in to kind of draft that narrative, representing British, German and French perspectives. And they were asked to devise a set of core principles and themes that would underpin the permanent exhibition. And so these historians became more and more sort of central to the whole process of establishing the museum. And they developed a transnational comparative discourse that would represent a break with the tradition, the prevailing tradition at that time of national museums and military history museums that transmit a national story. It was decided that the museum wouldn't privilege one national story over another, but that a single narrative would be illustrated by parallel displays of German, French and British objects throughout the museum. I can show you briefly an example. If we look at on the right hand side here, the top image is German, the middle one French, and the one at the bottom is less easy to see, but that's a British example, all illustrating women at work and how women were mobilised in munitions factories and so on. And if you can see on the right-hand side, it's rather small, but around the edges, the periphery of the museum, this kind of parallel display goes on, illustrating every theme and every sort of topic that's displayed in the museum. We have this tripartite parallel display. So this was quite strikingly original at the time and unusual, and it signalled an unwavering commitment to this comparative approach. There was no collection at the time of the establishment of the museum. The museum was an idea before it was a collection. So the historian's work also informed the process of acquisition. And although weapons, uniforms and military regalia that we would traditionally associate with a war museum were of course included, as you can see here, there was also a real prioritisation of more sort of banal and ephemeral items that were less commonly seen in museums at the time, reflecting the social and cultural turns in history that the historians were interested in. The museum's head curator, she's still there, but since 1994, sorry, I should say that this museum was opened in 1992, but this curator has been in place since 1994 and explains that the individual is at the centre of the discourse, and emphasis is therefore placed on all those things that illustrate individual behaviour, whether among soldiers or among civilians. I've got that quote there for you. So it was an anthropological approach, really, that informed the expansion of the collection and the discourse. And we can see here, if you look on the right in the this dugout, this horizontal, they call them fosse in French, in the museum floor. This is the French fosse, so it's a French soldier's uniform and everything that a French soldier typically would have carried with him in the trenches. And we can see examples of artisanal objects. For example, this musical instrument would have been handmade. I think this one's made from a cigar box. There are others made from helmets and so on. And there's also even the smallest items that a soldier would have carried. The sort of banal objects of everyday life. Weapons are also included in the exhibition, but in this particular room, the soldiers' uniforms are just accompanied by what they carried. So that would be, in terms of weapons, it's just a rifle or a pistol or objects of sort of interpersonal violence. All of the artillery, machine guns, mortars and so on, the weapons that did most of the damage, of course, in the First World War, they are all in the next room, quite far away from the uniforms that represent the soldiers. Instead, those weapons are located next to fosse, which include medical items, medical equipment, and also examples of camouflage, pierced helmets, very primitive gas masks. And so they highlight instead human vulnerability and suffering in relation to mechanised weaponry rather than perpetration. And as you can hopefully see from these photographs, the Historial has forged quite a unique visual identity among war museums through a combination of the neo-modern architecture, which we saw here, and the unadorned kind of museography, which has a kind of aesthetic that recalls a French art museum. The interior of the museum is configured as an open space with chronological rooms spiralling around a central hall. Everything is sort of oriented horizontally in order to promote quiet contemplation. There's blank white walls and polished wooden floors, large windows let in a lot of natural light, providing a connection with the landscape. And there's no attempt to recreate any scenes or atmosphere of war. It's a rather austere aesthetic approach. And Jay Winter, one of the historians who helped to put the museum together, has said that this stylized representation of war is deliberately remote from those displays which pretend to bring you to the front line. they reject the pseudo-realism of immersive museography. So that's the Historiale in a nutshell. I'll move on now to In Flanders Fields Museum in Ypres. And unlike the Historiale at the Somme, this museum was not the first one in its location to commemorate the First World War. So the city of Ypres has long been a centre for battlefield tourism, and there have been war museums in and around Ypres for most of the last 100 years. The building that you see that, that houses the museum is the old Cloth Hall, which dominates the city centre. And it in fact also housed a war museum since the 1960s. This pre-existing exhibition is described in a 1977 battlefield guidebook as featuring displays of equipment, weapons, badges and insignia, medals and documents, photographs and maps. So it sounds like quite a traditional military museum. The coordinator of the current museum explains that the impetus for establishing a new museum in the 90s came from the local officials noticing that there was a really growing trend in the 80s and 90s of more and more battlefield tourism, but people were less and less interested in this museum. They would go in and come out in a few minutes. They found it old-fashioned and out of date. So there was a need to create a new museum. Now the Cloth Hall, the building that houses the museum, was originally a medieval commercial centre. It was destroyed during the First World War and then rebuilt. So the museum makers really like to stress the symbolic significance of the building, which had once been a thriving meeting place and then became a sort of primary witness to the effects of the First World War. So this building also juxtaposes the medieval status of the city with its 20th century identity as a martyred city. And in this way, it brings a kind of redemptive message of peace, while also bringing together the two fronts of the war, the domestic front and the fighting front. And it symbolises the vulnerability of civilian life in wartime. And this notion of civilian suffering is really central to Belgium's memory of the First World War, which emphasises the plight of refugees and those living under occupation. And to an extent, really, that's in other countries is perhaps more consistent with Second World War memory. So at the same time, the museum makers wanted to kind of highlight this aspect of Belgian memory of the civilian side, but they also wanted to avoid framing their permanent exhibition as one that would only appeal to a narrowly national memory community. I have a quotation here from the coordinator of the museum, who said that this is not a war that we should tell from a military perspective or from the general's perspective or even from a national perspective, but from the experience of war as lived by the people who participated and who were bystanders. So this commitment to privileging the experience of ordinary people of all origins caught up in world events closely resembles the tenets of the transnational and comparative anthropological approach that we saw at Péronne at the Historiale. And like the Historiale, In Flanders Fields Museum also takes a consistently transnational approach, highlighting experiences of combatants from a range of nationalities, but with most emphasis on Belgium, and then those three main belligerents, the same as Péronne, Britain, France, and Germany. The museum also resembles the Historiale in the prominent position it gives to the civilian experience of the First World War, and both museums also reject a heroic reading of the conflict. In fact, this museum was awarded the Council of Europe Museum Prize in the year 2000 in recognition of its depiction of the First World War as, I quote, a European tragedy rather than a stage for the performance of heroic deeds. So far I've highlighted mostly similarities in the discourse and the focus, but the configuration and the narration is very different at this museum. Whereas at the Historiale we had a fairly coolly scientific voice, a kind of disembodied voice representing a distilled historiographic sort of consensus, right from the top level texts through the sort of thematic texts, right down to the object description texts. There's a contrast at this museum. In Flanders Fields, there is a museum voice. There is a chronological story narrated by a single museum voice in the same 3 levels of text. But this museum voice quickly seems to kind of recede in juxtaposition to, let me show another picture, here we are, in juxtaposition to first-hand accounts. The museum reproduces verbatim testimonies of people involved in the conflict. And these testimonies represent the multinational and multicultural makeup of the wartime population of the city. And they're kind of employed, if you like, to articulate the museum's discourse in quite literally a multivocal program. You go through the museum and you hear all of these voices. They engage you directly. You don't have to wear headphones. You can see video installations, and the audio is there to draw you in. In this example, we have soldiers, 4 different soldiers from different nationalities, all talking about the same event, and they're all on the landscape-oriented screen, and then they take turns on the portrait-oriented screen, and they speak in their native languages. And there's video installations throughout the museum as one of the methods in which these testimonies are kind of brought to life. So unlike the Historial, in Flanders Fields Museum is an immersive museum that uses audiovisual media and creative scenography to evoke emotional responses in visitors. There's an advertising leaflet published in the 90s that exhorts visitors to discover what it feels like to be a victim of the conflict. I think I have this on the screen, here we are. Discover what it feels like to be a victim of the conflict. You can dig deep into the past and draw lessons from it for the future, because in war, everyone is a loser. The message is continue to work for peace. So the instruction here to empathize with victimhood and the casting of all the participants in war as losers are of course aligned with the cosmopolitan sort of imperatives of cosmopolitan memory, much like at the Historial, but there's a much more direct approach towards engaging visitors with emotions. So the permanent exhibition is largely narrated through a mosaic of personal perspectives, and the use of personal stories is a crucial feature of the discourse in a way that contrasts with the approach at the Historial. So whereas the Historial casts itself as an anthropological museum, relying on archetypes that may stand in for the individual and the universal, in Flanders Fields Museum spotlights personal perspectives and biographical details, drawing visitors towards individuals in a strategy designed to promote empathy between visitors today and participants in the war. So to conclude, while the Historial's aesthetic approach deliberately tries to maintain critical distance by providing new perspectives and shedding new light, in Flanders Fields Museum is much more immersive and appeals to pathos, in particular through its use of video and immersive displays. Their discourses promote similar messages, but differ in terms of the use of personal narratives, which in Flanders Fields Museum favours and the Historial avoids. Whilst multi-perspectivity is available at both museums, it may be more accessible in Flanders Fields due to the foregrounding of individual experience and the use of testimony, which can draw the visitor in, versus the Historial strategy of allowing objects to speak for themselves. The Historial's minimal aesthetic avoids opportunities for voyeurism and attempts to maintain historical distance, affording critical analysis. But whilst the collection illustrates a discourse centred on ordinary individual experience, the individuals are archetypes rather than real people. And George Moss has explored how nations subsumed individuality in processes of commemoration. So arguably the Historial's reliance on archetypes rather than individual biographies misses an opportunity to restore the individuality of soldiers and civilians. But then again, in Flanders Fields Museum, arguably the appeal to pathos could lead to the collapse of historical distance, and with it the collapse of critical distance. A tension arises between the need for critical distance and the benefits of cultivating an ethical connection with the past through what Alison Landsberg describes as prosthetic memory. So the only other thing I have to say is that I'm still kind of trying to analyse how this all plays out in the responses of visitors, in particular young visitors to these museums. But I'd be very interested to hear anyone else's opinions or reflections based on their own visits or just what they've seen today. So thank you very much. I do have some references to show you. That's all. Thanks.
I shall unmute so you can hear my clapping for that fascinating paper. Thank you very much, Eleanor. I thought that was particularly interesting, the way that you contrasted two museums which ostensibly have a very similar purpose and a very similar ethos, and the way that, you know, despite that, they've taken very, very different approaches to how they're presenting the material. It will be fascinating to hear then how your visitor studies of those two museums, what results they reveal. So please, there are some questions coming in. We already had quite a lot of questions for Vikki. Please feel free to keep typing your questions in the Q&A as we go along, for individual speakers or just for the panel as a whole. So we come now to Kieran Burns, who's going to be talking about Mind the Gaps, Tracing Conflict Narratives at the House of European History. Just to say a little bit about Kieran. Kieran is a senior curator at the House of European History, responsible for the museum's sections on European heritage and memory, imperialism and science in the 19th century, which sounds like quite a bit to deal with. Oh, and the First World War as well. He's lead curator for the temporary exhibition Restless Youth, Growing Up in Europe, 1945 to Now. With over 20 years of curatorial experience, Kieran is a former Director for Education and Training at the Irish Museums Association. He has written on the need to represent a diversity of histories within the traditional museum environment, and is a passionate advocate of the museum as a public service institution. So thank you, Kieran, for being here today, and we're very much looking forward to hearing your talk.
Thank you, David. Thank you to the university for giving me the opportunity this afternoon, and thank you to Vikki and to Eleanor for such stimulating presentations, which feel very close to home for me, and I'll tell you why in just a moment. David, I'm going to deftly try and share my screen here, so if you can just tell me if this works for you. Screen. Okay, here we go. Are we good? Okay. I guess I would say that I probably should introduce a little bit the project that I work for, in case some of you may not be familiar with it. The House of European History is, I guess, geographically at the center of the different points we've been talking about today. We're here in Brussels, so we're geographically between London. We're between Peronne to our south, and we're between Ypres in Belgium to our north. And in some respects, I think in terms of our approaches to the exhibition as well, I think in terms of our philosophy and our approach, I think we sit somewhere in the middle of all of those different institutions. The House of European History opened in 2017. It began its life with a curatorial team in 2011. We don't, as such, or we didn't rather at the very beginning of the project, have our own collection. So we relied very much in putting our exhibition together on borrowing from museums across Europe, including IWM, including Historia de la Grande Guerre, and indeed Flanders Fields. And in this case, without a collection as our first point of departure, really the narrative of the exhibition became central. So one of the main tasks that we had in our early years was to put together our narrative. The exhibition focuses mainly on the 19th and 20th centuries, although it does have reference to earlier periods and indeed later periods. But we developed three main criteria for what would basically go into our narrative. Those criteria are, we would look at historical phenomena which have originated in Europe. We would look at historical phenomena which have generally, more or less, spread throughout the continent. And we would look at historical phenomena which are still relevant today. And when we talk about Europe, it's also important to say that we don't simply talk about the European Union, we talk about Europe in a broader context, which of course raises the question of how do we define where Europe begins and where Europe ends. The image that you see here is our building in Park Leopold in Brussels, which is an adapted installation in a dental clinic which was originally constructed in the 1930s by the American Philanthropists Foundation of George Eastman of the Kodak Eastman Company. So the House of European History then is about shared history, and it's about a change of perspective, if you like. What we don't do is present the individual histories of 27 different member states. So you don't come to our museum and see a Portuguese corner or an Irish corner or a French or a Polish corner. We are about the points of history which exist in common across Europe. And because so much history is filtered through a national perspective, both in museums and in education, in school curricula, that can be a bit disjointing for people when they come here. The critic from the University of Amsterdam, Elizabeth Budner, has noted that in relation to our exhibition, that non-national priorities mean that visitors looking mainly for canonical national identities and individual, or events rather, are doomed is quite dramatic, to leave in disappointment. So there is a shift in perspective between the national perspective and what we do in the House of European History. No more or less than there is in the shift between national museums in places like Peron. But for the House of European History, it's very important to note that the transnational is not inherently, or need not be, an antagonistic historical perspective to the national, but could be understood rather as an additional one. Very important to us is the concept of memory, because it allows for a greater sense of multiple perspectives. Memory, as we know, changes through different iterations, through different historical periods, and is also different from different geographical contexts. So very much what binds Europe together and what divides it is quintessentially shared memory. So we opted in our work very much for the concept of memory rather than, for example, the concept of European identity, which we felt was much more problematic. I'm going to talk to you a little bit today about two approaches in our exhibition, specifically about our permanent exhibition. One is how we approach conflict, and the other is how we approach the idea of colonization or colonialism and post-colonialism. In terms of how we do deal with conflict, I'm going to talk to you about the First World War, because this is the gallery that I worked on. And here I would say that I would identify, I guess, four main messages or four main planks of our approach. And again, relating to Peron, relating to Ypres, relating to IWM, you can see that very much there's a similar approach being taken here. So the first main message that we were concerned with, I guess, was to show war as an inherent and transnational part of the European experience. And as is the case with World War I, it's a formative shaping element of subsequent history over several generations. So one might think, for example, about how the First World War, the memory of the First World War has changed through time. So for example, you could look at the rise of fascist movements in Italy or National Socialism in Germany in the immediate aftermath of the war. Or you could look at, for example, the beginning of the European integration process after the Second World War, which indeed owed some of its impetus in figures like Jean Monnet to World War I. Or indeed, you could look at the reconciliation, the Franco-German reconciliation in the 1970s and 80s with Francois Mitterrand and Helmut Kohl, for example, at the Battle of Verdun site in 1984. So you can see that this is an event with repercussions through subsequent history. And as the quote from Paolo Manelli shows from 1918, it's our irrevocable inheritance. And therefore, it's very important, if we are going to be fettered by our memories, that visitors understand and can engage with critically how that process works. The second main plank of what we do, I guess, in our approach generally, but also in the approach to conflict, is to struggle or to try to create an emotional engagement with the exhibition narrative as a precursor to cognitive engagement in European history. So we're talking about a sort of feedback loop that exists between cognitive engagement and emotional engagement, as is talked about, for example, by Lynn Dearking and John Falk, who are tremendously influential in museum learning. And we exist in terms of our museology. I don't think we are quite as austere or restrained as Perron, and we are certainly not as immersive and scenographic as in Flanders Fields, which incidentally is the second iteration of a museum in there since the 2000s. So it is indeed even more immersive and more multivocal than it used to be. Third approach to war, again, is to show war as a cross-societal effort, extending in its consequences far beyond the battlefield with experiences common across Europe. So we have common themes which transcend national boundaries, and we illustrate them with different case studies and different examples from different national contexts. And that interaction of seeing the individual and local with the transnational creates quite an interesting counterpoint. Again, referring to Jay Winter, of course, we can't talk about war without talking about Jay Winter, who's been a good friend to the House of European History as well. But the colours and shapes we see in the contemporary world are shaded and shaped by the staggering consequences of war, and doffing the cap to the Imperial War Museum, which said it very simply, that war shapes lives. So the last approach then we take in relation to conflict has got to do with our objects. We didn't start with a collection. We're amassing a collection, but we really had to borrow from museums across Europe. And I think Vicki's point about objects with provenance and objects with stories is tremendously important for us to try and get these objects and to show them to the visitor. So it was very important for us to present a range of material culture, not just militaria, but to show a diversity of objects from the everyday, from the realm of political propaganda, from fundraising material, from material relating to amputees and to medicine and war, across the range, and moving beyond that, again, referring to Jay Winter, the idea of a boys with toys narrative in a war museum. And a very important thing to say is that in placing objects side by side from different countries to highlight common themes, as it were, I think you create something which is a little bit new, a little bit different. I think by putting objects together from different national contexts, I think you create a dialogue between those objects. You see how, of course, we can't equalize historical experience, but you can see how certain things do exist. For example, war propaganda might exist in different iterations in different countries, and everybody is deploying tropes of a certain kind. So I think it's very important to create that space in a museum. And again, as I said, to kind of take a step beyond the national museological context and indeed the national educational context. Then moving a little bit to the topic of colonialism and slavery, which of course is very current at the moment. What I will do is talk about, again, where we show this in the exhibition and to try and show the main messages that we're trying to convey. And again, we're doing this from a transnational point of view. So we're not necessarily highlighting any one country or singling out any one country, even though we will use examples from those countries to illustrate certain themes. So the first place a visitor will encounter the issue of colonialism and slavery, for example, is in our opening section of the exhibition, where slavery and colonialism are presented among 14 fundaments or 14 foundation points of European history and heritage. So here you will see positive phenomena like the rise of democracy, like philosophy or the rule of law or enlightenment. but you will also see state terror, you will also see genocide, you will also see slavery and colonialism. And at this point in the exhibition, we take a particular approach which reflects our criteria I outlined earlier. We take an iconic object, usually an historic object, we present it alongside a contemporary image, and we ask a viewer, or the viewer rather, the audience, a question related to that topic. So here, for example, in relation to slavery, at the bottom we show slave chains from Ghana in West Africa from the 18th century. We show an image of a mural by Banksy from 2012 of a modern sweatshop, and we pose the question to the visitor, can we truly say that slavery has ended today? In the context of colonialism, we show this Benin figure representing a Portuguese sailor, a soldier. We show here this image on the right of the invasion of Iraq in 2003, and the question is about Europeans' perception of themselves as civilizers in the world, but that being different to how other people will see that role and that mission. The next place where we talk about colonialism and issues of imperialism is the most substantive, I think, in the exhibition, and that's in our 19th century gallery. And here we talk about the brutality and exploitation of European colonialism side by side with the idea of progress, indeed in a symbiotic relationship with the idea of scientific and technical progress of Europe in the 19th century. So we address, again referring to Butner, the racist, exploitative, violent and militaristic aspects of imperialism. We do that very much with an audience of secondary school students in mind, because it's the main audience that we have for the House of European History. So young people in their teens. So it's very important to not take things for granted and to try and bring the very dry political history of isms, of socialism, communism, colonialism, imperialism, etc., to life. The scenography that you see here, the bottommost image in this slide, is our display case, which is essentially a reproduction of a palace from an exhibition from the 19th century, perhaps Paris in 1900, or indeed London in 1851, referred colloquially to by us as the Crystal Palace. And then we also talk about colonialism in the context of war. Again, in the context of the First World War, the idea of showing war through colonial networks, not simply something which impacts upon Europeans, moving towards what John Horne has described as a denationalization of the spaces of war. And then the final substantive part, at least, I will talk about is how we talk about the idea and the phenomena related to decolonization. And here I think there have been some criticisms leveled at our gallery space, and I think with perhaps some justification, because we talk about decolonization at the same time as we talk about Cold War and at the same time as we talk about European integration. Chronologically, they exist in the same space. There's a lot of competition for space at this part in our gallery. And as you see here, again, using the critique of Elizabeth Butner, there is something to say that from the First World War onwards in the House of European History, imperialism largely recedes from our narrative. And that's problematic for lots of different reasons for us, and it is a challenge to address going forward. Not least among those reasons is this quotation from Timothy Schneider, who spoke at the House of European History last year, and this quote comes from Vienna in 2019. And it's this idea which has critical mass at the moment, that the European integration project, rather than being born as necessarily a peace project, which some people say is a myth, it is more something which is born out of an attempt to answer the question what to do after empire. And many of the foundation states and later the joining states of the European integration process were either empires or former empires. So this quote from Timothy Schneider, "You are more than your myths. Europe was the substitute for empire for both trade and power. All of it," meaning European integration, "has to do with empire." So I think that suggests a challenge for us in bringing this really at the heart of our narrative and something we will have to address going forward. So on that, I guess just to conclude, in my experience, I will offer maybe three main challenges dealing with how the approach that we take to history, and the transnational approach maybe as well. And they are briefly described. Firstly, the tyranny of the narrative line, and indeed the question of whose line is it anyway. We know that the most interesting experiences are local ones, are personal ones. They come from objects of a personal nature. But yet at the same time, when you deal with vast swathes and arcs of history, it's very important to maintain that top line. So there is always a tension between the two things. And also trying to say a big history in a small space, there's a tension between a coherent narrative, so one that makes sense, and a master narrative, one which might be seen to exclude nuance, to exclude difference, to exclude diversity. And then the final question then is questions of voice and multiple perspectives, multivocality and multiple perspectivity. I think these are two very important parts of our programming going forward and of our work going forward again. But that's it from me, as far as I'll go. So we can take the questions then as they come up at the end. Thanks.
I'm unmuting now so that you can all hear me clapping. That was collectively for all our wonderful speakers. Thank you so much. David has tasked me with possibly the slightly daunting prospect of saying a few immediate words in response to these wonderful papers and drawing them together a little. I won't, I promise, use too much of our time in this, as I can see lots of questions coming into the Q&A, and actually some of my immediate responses also pick up on some of those questions. So thank you all so much. I think my comment is going to be focusing on two interlinked areas. I want to think in your papers about the gains and losses of cosmopolitan feeling, and what do we gain and lose through an emphasis on the common or shared emotional experience, that many of the papers picked out an emphasis on common ground, cross-national common ground. So I was really taken with Vicki's charting of the form and mythology, something the new Second World War galleries will be very much kind of in dialogue with and slightly up against, of some visitors who would like still to have that story of plucky little Britain on its own, rather than an embedded story, the transnational story that you want to tell. And it struck me that many, if not all, of the museums you discuss have an emphasis on that international interconnection or lack of it at the heart of these narratives. So I think this is coming up a little bit in the comments thread as well. Something that we might want to tease out of all of these is what happens to those narratives of interconnection in our current moment of cosmopolitanism under great strain. So particularly in a British context, our Brexit moment, but also the wider challenges of confronting our colonial past, the Black Lives Matter movement, and comments by, I think it was Ingrid Sharp in the comments box saying, how do we reconcile these narratives of interconnection with that kind of history of discrimination, which leads me on to the other thing I wanted to say about the emphasis on shared or comparable experience. That came across particularly strongly in Eleanor's paper and her discussion of In Flanders Fields Museum. She quoted a section asking visitors to discover what it feels like to be a victim of the conflict, as if the victim position is that which can be most readily shared by museum visitors. And I was really interested in that idea and how that perhaps also informs quite a lot of curatorial practice around the shared experience, because does that imply that victimhood is equally accessible as an emotional experience to us all? I'm thinking of Judith Butler's work on precarity and how an idea of shared precariousness could also be quite dangerous, because precarity is not equally distributed. So we will not all have equal access to an appreciation of the victim position. And in reaching towards that idea that we can all empathise around suffering, not one I want to befoul in any way. I think it's in many ways a very laudable aspiration of a museum to want to create that empathetic experience. But in doing so, what happens to narratives of perpetration and violence? How do we recognise those who have taken the position to create victimhood if we are all to embrace a shared experience of suffering? So yes, I think to draw that together into something perhaps a little more direct, my two main points from it would be how are these ideas of cosmopolitan feeling inflected in a moment of cosmopolitan crisis, and what happens to more uncomfortable narratives of perpetration when the effort is to create political and social empathy. I hope that made some sense to you, pulled together in the moment. I'll turn over to our panel for any immediate responses, and then I think David's going to open up to the floor.
Thanks so much, Holly. Sorry, my internet momentarily dropped out there, but perhaps it would be useful if we open things up in the order that people spoke. Would everybody be comfortable with that? Yeah, so it'll be Vicki first.
Hi, yes, thank you for those. That's interesting comments, actually. The thing that I picked up on, first of all, was yes, there is going to be that element of shared experiences of pain and suffering when you're talking about conflict and war. But we've also included within our gallery, and we've done it purposefully to include stories of joy and happiness and opportunity. We have a selection of personal stories, for example, related to the mobilization of women, and they talk about the opportunity to travel, to have a better financial position, to meet new people, to sort of use the conflict and see it as not necessarily in always like a negative or a bad light, or particularly be a victim of their experiences of war. And I think that's really important to be able to include in the spaces as well. I know that I work on the Second World War galleries, and there's a question I noticed that came up about the Holocaust galleries, and I know I'll be able to answer that one, but essentially the Holocaust galleries are going to be focusing quite a lot on this sense of how do you talk about the perpetrator, and how do you get visitors to understand potentially the way or the thought processes that they were thinking. So it's definitely this sense of trying to always sort of get people to feel like they connect with the victim is something that we are trying to mitigate as well. Yeah.
Thank you, Vicki. Eleanor, can we come to you?
Yes, of course. Thanks, Holly, for those reflections. Now, of course, unlike Vicki and Kieran, I'm on the outside of these two museums I was talking about, so I can't speak to their sort of, their latest responses to current affairs. But from what I see, in terms of your points about cosmopolitanism under strain, I mean, in Péronne, this is quite visible in that the local population is quite a deprived area, and the local population even, some people have some resentment towards the museum and find that it's a bit elitist and a bit sort of Parisian and not really reflective of their kind of interests. So there, I mean, in the local press, there's like a series of articles that went on a few years ago criticizing the museum, and then the museum sort of responding, saying, you know, we're not elitist, and, you know, come and visit us, and so on. So there is definitely an issue there, but I think in both museums I don't see them sort of changing their approach. You know, if anything, they seem to double down on the cosmopolitan message. But yeah, I mean, there's definitely there's more to explore, I think. And then in the question about perpetration, I would say that in both museums, but especially at the Historial, while there is violence, you know, there's evidence of violence, and there's images where especially the results of violence are visible, the perpetration itself is very much abstract. As I mentioned about the juxtaposition of the artillery and the medical equipment and so on. So yeah, there's a kind of disconnect, if you like, and the emphasis on victimhood kind of forgets that the people who were victims may have been perpetrators as well. In Flanders Fields, there's one, I can think of one of these videos that is like a testimony that's delivered through an actor on a screen, who is a perpetrator, and he's kind of your archetypical German scientist who developed one of the gases. I think it was ypirite, the first one of the first chemical weapons, and that's juxtaposed with another actor playing another German role, and that's a kind of rank and file soldier who witnessed that first gas attack, who was of course on the side of the aggressor but witnessed the terrible effects. So that's quite an interesting juxtaposition where perpetration is explored in a more subtle way perhaps. But it's definitely something that these museums are not really putting at the forefront of their narratives, I would say.
Thanks, Helena. Kieran, can we come to you?
Sure, you can, yeah. I guess to go for the first point about maybe the crisis and its impacts for transnationalism and cosmopolitanism, I mean, we've always had there's a deep irony in what we do at the House of European History, and that is that it's a question of who's our target audience. Well, you know, nominally it's it's the hundreds of millions of citizens of the European Union, but then we're also based in Brussels, and realistically, even at the best of times, the people who are going to come and visit us are only going to be people coming from Belgium, maybe Northern France, maybe Western Germany, Southern Netherlands, Luxembourg, perhaps. So there's a kind of a catchment area which is actually quite localized. So, you know, to truly be realizing our vision of being transnational, I think we're going to have to, all I can say about the current moment is I think we have to see it as an opportunity. We have to see it as an opportunity to actually get on the bus, as Spike Lee would say, and get there and put more content online, become more creative online, to extend the audience, not just because they can't physically come at the moment, but also because there are so many people who cannot physically come anyway with us. So there's a kind of a dual nature to that. So I would try and put a positive spin on it and say, well, you know, every crisis is an opportunity, and I think this one is. I don't think, you know, we began the project as curators in 2011, and we opened in 2017. And even in terms of the context of Europe, you know, certain things happened in between 2011 and 2016, where we had with Brexit, for example. We also had the financial crisis, or the tail end of the financial crisis, you know, spinning on in 2012, 2013, up to 2015. So a museum developing is like an ocean liner. It's a slow-moving thing, and it's not easy to turn it quickly. So as you're developing the project, you're seeing what's happening outside you all the time, and it makes you question what you do. But I also think it validates what you do. I think we believe strongly that there is a need for the transnational, and I think, you know, we wouldn't be anything without that remit. So I think it's at the heart of what we do. In relation to the question about victimhood, it's interesting to hear that back, because it's not the first association I would make with the idea of creating emotional engagement. Because for me, I would see it as creating emotional engagement almost as a curator's tool. It's a way of getting beyond, for want of a better word, the dry and the boring parts of history. And this is particularly true if you're dealing with a subject like European integration, for example, which is quite dry and mostly based on documents. So for me, it's not necessarily a given that emotional engagement with the visitor means focusing on the victim. I think it means, for me, it means focusing on many different aspects, including joy, including emotions. It's the full range of emotions that make that connection. You can connect it through a sense of victimhood, but you can also connect it through a sense of curiosity. You can connect it through a sense of presenting what's new, what's different, what's hidden, what's not previously been presented heretofore. And a very important part for us in the House of European History is that we operate in 24 languages. So I challenge anyone to beat that. I know that they've got 4 in IPRA, 4. We've got 24 official languages of the European Union, and that challenges curators who like to put text on labels and on walls, because you need a very big wall. And even things like, you know, 50 words in English will automatically double as you go into Hungarian and into Greek. So this really puts a restriction on the amount of text that we can use. And this again causes a shift over into things which create that immediate emotional engagement and things which create a connection. So I don't necessarily think that it's an absolute association between the two things, because I do think that there is a pitfall, yes, absolutely, that if you concentrate on the victim all the time, well, as you say, where do you leave the perpetrator, and who incidentally is the perpetrator?
Thank you.
Thanks very much, Kieran. One of the things, I'm going to just slightly abuse my chair's privilege here, one of the things that occurred to me very strongly with your paper, Vikki, in relation to Holly's point about, you know, the rise in kind of pushback against attempts to provide wider perspectives on conflict and other aspects of history in Europe, is that you were saying actually that when you speak to your visitors, they are interested in hearing those other perspectives.
Yes, definitely. So we have done over the last 4 years quite a few audience participation events where we've just tried to sort of increase our discussions with the local community and also people that have never interacted with the museum at all, to ask them questions, because I think sometimes when curators especially are sort of getting excited about the objects in a room in the middle of a sort of dark museum, they do forget sometimes that some people aren't quite as excited as we are by some of those objects. And we want to know what it is that does make them excited. And that's how we know that these sort of personal connections are things that people find interesting. As Kieran was saying, they find them intriguing, they're curious. They might not necessarily feel, it might not always be empathy, it might be a connection because of a familiar sort of story or a familiar type of person's personality even. We try to put in anecdotes where possible, so you really feel like as you're going through the gallery you can get to know the people that experienced war. And yes, when it comes to the British Empire especially, we did quite a few public forum groups, and we asked them, we posed several questions to them and asked people what it is they expected IWM to put in, what they thought we might not include. And we had some really interesting answers, and a lot of people said that they wanted more, but they didn't really know what it is that they were looking for. They had heard with lots of the sort of social and cultural discussions in the news that British history was obviously not so rosy, but they didn't really understand why or when or what or how it happened. And so they did see IWM as an authoritative voice, and also other museums as well, when sometimes in a world of lots of different varying sort of news, it's hard to pick out what maybe is sort of authoritative or accurate. So that's why we've tried as much as possible to sort of give a balanced view. I'm trying not to answer one of the questions that's in the actual Q&A that's related to it, but maybe I should. Would that be okay? Because there was a question.
Go ahead. If you feel that kind of connects to one of the questions, then please do.
It does. So it was a question from Rachel that she asked whether or not to what extent IWM is going to explore some diversity of groups' participation in the war effort as being something involuntary. And that was something that we discussed with our participation groups. And what we have created is a sort of large audiovisual and interactive element of the galleries that's completely focused on the British Empire. And it'll have a soundscape with a variety of different languages, and it will have a sort of introductory video for people who maybe need that beginning sort of explanation of what the British Empire was. And from the very outset, from the get-go, it says, it acknowledges the contribution of the British Empire, and it acknowledges Britain's position as being able to control and exploit it where it needed to. So it's very stark and it's very clear from the outset. And then visitors are able to delve down into a sort of interactive database, which includes assets and photographs, like some of the ones that I showed in my presentation, and like the one of civilian labourers that was also referenced in that question. And that is where we're using the opportunity to sort of show the image and potentially show some of the language that was used to describe the caption of it originally, which now the language is not appropriate. So we have changed that language, or we have discussed why we've made those changes. And we've also used statistics where we don't necessarily have a huge amount of information about, say, the protagonist of the photo, to highlight some of those discrepancies between exploitation and racism, and differences in pay and differences in treatment, and that Britain had for varying different people that were within the British Empire. So it is going to be far more critical in answer to that question, and part of that is because we believe it needs to be included, but also because it's what our audience is demanding, and so we are trying to to fulfill what they're looking for in the museum, because essentially it is for them.
Thank you. That also leads, I think, possibly onto Matthew Roberts' question there about examples of what he calls sort of British cruelty, like the Bengal famine. So you're going to address those head on as well, I would guess.
Yes, so the Bengal famine will be included, and what I've done in this particular area, because it's one of the areas that I cover, is I've made sure that when we're talking about the Bengal famine as well, we are doing it from the point of view of Indian civilians and people that experienced it, rather than British people who were in Bengal experiencing it. For example, in IWM's collections, we have quite a few sketches of famine victims that were sketched by British soldiers who witnessed it, who were stationed there at the time. And they are, very interesting, and they are very evocative, but they are a British gaze. And I, through some research and through some contacts, I managed to find an Indian artist called Chitra Prasad, who sketched very similar style, but rather than just sketching and then walking away and sending it home to Britain, etc., he was able to have a conversation in their own language with the civilians that he was drawing and sketching. And so on the back of his drawings, he has those conversations recorded, which are fascinating. Now, to the average visitor walking through the galleries at some pace, or even if they're just fatigued, because let's be fair, these galleries will probably take you about 2 hours if you're speeding through, to be honest with you. They may just see, they might not see the sort of the difference between a sketch done by potentially a British person or a person, an Indian civilian. But we thought it was very, very important to put that in, so that if you do take the time to have a look, that you see that we're looking at it from a much more, from the point of view of the people who are directly involved. And yes, there will be discussions. I mean, as Kieran said, sometimes we're looking at sort of 50 words to caption a large event, which makes things very difficult. But yes, we will be talking about the Bengal famine, and there'll also be criticisms of Churchill through the eyes again of the people that were criticising him. So there are Indian national pamphlets, for example, showing a very gluttonous Churchill on a table with starving Indians looking for scraps beneath it, and the language, and it has the language, several languages that it has been written in to be dispersed to the public, and we've translated that into English for our visitors as well, so that they can see the thoughts of the time.
Thanks, Vicki. We do have two more very specific questions to you before I'll open it out to the more general questions for all of the panel. So Stefan Jäger was asking about whether you were still going to have more experiential and immersive scenographic elements in the new exhibition.
Yes, we will. So as well as the sort of ways that I've been talking about, a big focus on people's stories and objects, there will also be some interactives. The large Empire one, which I mentioned, there'll be quite a lot of audiovisual archive footage, but also actually we've done some filming in the Philippines, which has been very difficult at the moment, especially with COVID, and also in Egypt, to show how some of these spaces look today, to sort of bring some things back into the present. And also in terms of bringing it back into how we're using these different types of curatorial techniques to show transnational stories. One of our activities within the gallery spaces that's sort of focused more towards children and family audiences, but there is a war artist activity. And as well as having explanation about what a British war artist is, we have also looked at German war artists and explanations and examples of them, and Japanese war artists, and also from the colonial war artist scheme, so that we expand the sort of understanding and knowledge of this conflict, because so that sort of key theme is embedded into every aspect of the galleries.
Thank you. Stefan's other question related to the Holocaust galleries, which you mentioned briefly before, but that they might become more integrated with the war galleries.
Yes, they will be in one very physical way, which will be the most obvious when you initially visit, which is that we will have a large V1 suspended between the two galleries. They will be open, not for you to be able to sort of walk between, but we are looking at the ways that the Holocaust is very much integrated within the Second World War narrative. There was a piece of research done, I think it was UCL a few years ago, where they spoke to people about their understanding of the Holocaust and of its relationship with the Second World War. And some of the stark responses that they received were things like believing that Britain went to war because of what Hitler was doing to the Jews, and they sort of didn't see the wider context. So those are the kind of things that we've had in mind, that we've been trying to navigate throughout the building of these two galleries simultaneously. And this large physical presence of the V1 between the two is particularly interesting, because from the Holocaust galleries above, the object will be interpreted from the point of view of the slave laborers that were building this particular weapon and their experiences and their treatment. And then from below, the same object will be interpreted in the Second World War galleries from the point of view of the people that experienced the bombing on their homes. So we'll be looking at how one object can be in both galleries at the same time and interpreted in two different ways at the same time. And then within the Holocaust galleries throughout, they will make more references to how their narrative is parallel to what's happening in the wider war, so that it is much clearer for visitors to understand how they're intertwined.
Thank you. This is not only making me really want to come and see this exhibition when it's completed, but also making me nostalgic for visiting any museum at all. But we can come on now to some questions which have been directed to all of the panelists, which we've addressed to an extent. The question here about using languages. So Kieran, you were talking about the challenges of moving away from monolingualism towards using all of the languages in the European community. And Eleanor, I'm guessing that's also an issue for the museums that you're looking at. How do they deal with the multilingualism of the conflict?
Yeah, thanks for the question. So in the Historial since 1992, everything has been translated into the three main languages of the three main belligerents that they depict, that are in the narrative. So it's all in French, English and German. And interestingly, they went alphabetically according to the French language and put German first, because Allemagne begins with an A. And apparently this didn't go down very well with some of the French visitors, not all of them, but some of them weren't happy with that. But yeah, they're very consistent with the translations. They're good quality translations, at least the English is good quality translation. They did, when they refurbished and renewed and changed a few things during the centenary, they did add Dutch as a fourth language, recognising a lot of visitors for whom that's their first language. But yeah, that's all. And it is a silent museum, so the text really is text. Whereas in Flanders Fields, as I showed you, there's a lot of video, so there's a lot of audio. And in those cases, as far as I recall, all of the spoken language will be in whatever native language it was first written in. And then it will have subtitles. I can't remember if those appear. I don't think they're simultaneous. Or maybe, no, they must be simultaneous, but maybe they're only into English. I'm afraid I can't remember about how the subtitles work. Perhaps they're simultaneously in the other three languages.
I seem to remember they are actually.
Yeah. That must be how it works, yeah. So somebody could be speaking, for example, in German, and then you would get English, Flemish and French translations simultaneously. But yeah, they have the four languages, again, consistently throughout. But they get over the problem of having a lot of text by having more sort of audio, more video. Whereas in the Historial, everything is text. It's a silent museum. Yeah.
Thank you. Kieran, can you tell us a bit more about how you're dealing with all of your languages? It sounds like an enormous challenge.
Yeah, fun. We actually have no text, believe it or not, or hardly any. We have text which tells you where you are in the exhibition, and then everything else is on a tablet. So every visitor who comes to the House of European History receives a small, I guess, mini tablet device with an earpiece, and they can select their language. So you can come and you can hear it in Portuguese, or you can come and hear it in Slovenian or in English or Irish. So any one of the 24 official languages of the European Union, the text is the same. So every movie, therefore, which has a commentary, the commentary is recorded and translated into all those other languages as well. So the tablet was felt to be the best fit for the multilingualism challenge, I guess, the best technical fit. We talked about changing labels that would change as you would look at them and you would select the language. But we felt that this would be difficult when you had different linguistic groups in the room at the same time, or indeed different languages within the same group. So the tablet was the solution that became. It largely, first of all, it works, which is great, and also largely is well received. There are some people who don't like the idea of taking a tablet, and if you tell them that they'll have to take a tablet, they will not want to. We have written information for people like that, but generally speaking, you have to explore that way. So it works, and I think it's quite important, because it's important for us to affirm that value of multilingualism as an institution of the European Union. It would be quite shocking for someone to come in and not be able to access their language in their own exhibition, access the exhibition in their own language. The exception is temporary exhibitions. Here, because of the logistics involved, we go with 4 languages. So we go with the 3 official languages of Belgium. So we go with German, we go with Flemish or Dutch and French, and then we go with English. So we have, if you like, a derogation to work in this way. And generally speaking, we don't have complaints with people like this, because for most people, I guess in Brussels, they'll have a second language, and one of those languages will be the second language. So it has changed the way we've approached interpretation, I think, because you will say less. Even if a tablet device has a nominal massive capacity of data, you will say less, and you will restrict yourself. And as I said, that doubling principle means that it has to be 50 words in English, because it'll be 100 words in Greek or Hungarian. So it has made us very concise in how we communicate. I think Peron would have more texts than we do, I think, in terms of what you see as you go around the exhibition. So yeah, but it's a work in progress. But I'm quite proud of it, actually. I'm quite proud of the idea that this is a museum where you can get those languages. Someone's going to ask me about Chinese, for example. We don't have it, but we have the capacity to add those in as we go.
Thank you. Vicki, is there any sort of move towards a greater multilingualism at IWM?
I'm very jealous of the iPad that Kieran just mentioned. That sounds amazing. And potentially, though, quite expensive, I would imagine. We at IWM have explored things like this before, and often it does come down to cost, unfortunately, and also the fact that these galleries will be permanent for 20 years and whether or not the technology would be able to be sustainable for that amount of time. Sometimes we actually find that we have to do slightly more basic audiovisual things, even within the galleries or interactives, in order so that they are durable and don't date quite as much. However, we have explored in the past different audio guides, although their actual sort of pickup for those is not as high, despite the fact that we have quite an international audience coming to the museum. With all of that in mind, that's one of the reasons why within the galleries we have tried to include more objects that have multi-languages on them, or the actual sounds and the spoken word of these different languages. And a few examples, so I mentioned in my paper that we have a Japanese song. We also have singing from Nigerian soldiers that was recorded. There are the translations, there's the shelter ticket with English translations next to it. We've got quite a lot of German and Italian documents, again, with their English translations, and more now related to in Hindu and Bengali, and items that have been picked up from Tarawa Beach that are in Japanese. So we've tried to make the different languages of the different countries more physically visible and more audibly visible when you walk through. They'll be included in the AVs. But in terms of actually having a sort of a guide in other languages, it's an aspiration, but not something that we've been able to achieve to quite an extent, as it sounds like Kieran has so far.
Thank you, Vicki. We've had a question come in from Nina Parish about those tablets you were talking about. Do you think they have an impact on the way that people interact with each other in the museum? I mean, I think I would share Nina's implicit observation there that when people are going around the exhibits, they're often talking with each other, aren't they? They're having debates about the exhibits, and I enjoy watching people do that. So do you have any sense of how it affects the visitor experience being tied to the tablet?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, okay, yes and no. I mean, yes, in the sense that I do think that there's a loss because you don't have the same freedom to just read and pass on. You have to locate it, you have to open it, you have to engage with it. And yeah, of course, and you're not going to have a common experience. I mean, the earpieces are only in one ear, so at least you have the chance to talk to your groups. I'm going to talk about a cliche, but I think it's true from what I see when I'm in the galleries. Is I think younger people, let's say, they're so used to looking at technology and talking to people and doing other things at the same time. It doesn't pose a huge problem to them. I see lots of people in their 20s and 30s talking and listening and going around at the same time. And indeed, the kind of navigating of the device can also help, because in a sense, if you're standing there and someone shows you something and you go, well, where are you? And you can help them find it, or I'm having a little bit of difficulty locating this. So it does provide a small activity for people to do as they go around. But I'd be lying to say that in the ideal world, we would go this way, or in sense that it is a technical fit for the principle of multilingualism. When we shift over into the temporary exhibitions, we have more freedom because we're on 4 languages. But, you know, I think as we assessed all of the different ranges of options we had, I think it was the best that we could come up with. And I think again, I would reinforce it, the value of being able to come from Portugal and read the text in your own language. If you take that away from somebody and not give them that opportunity, and it's a museum about Europe, I think the dissonance that you create is far greater than the dislocation that's created by having the device. So you weigh up the two, I guess.
Thank you. There's a supplementary questions coming on the chat as well in relation to that. So I think it's Tillman Altenberg is asking, what do you have a particular brief for your translators there? Because translation is a kind of complex process, and you're talking about, I guess, histories here which are understood in different ways in different linguistic contexts. So how do you go about getting those translations and briefing your translators?
Sorry, my microphone was off appropriately. Yeah, interestingly, so we all have separate second languages, third languages, working for the European institution, but the language of the exhibition team, because we were international, was English, working language was English. And we took the decision to produce the master, quote unquote, text in English. And to do that, we drew up our own criteria for, not using passive voice and avoiding arcane expressions and things like that. How do we deal with the name changes of different countries over different periods of time? A whole strategy for that. And then we worked with copywriters to make that as succinct as possible. And then we gave that to translators. So we put a lot of our effort into making the best first language text as you possibly could do, because that's the most important thing for a translator. If they receive something that's good and clear and concise, it's much easier for them to work in their own language. And then we would deal with the translators who were in-house, because they're European institutions, in terms of how to handle the different meanings of different things in different languages. And often it would be said to us, oh, you can't say that in English, because in French it means this. Our approach would be, well, if in French it means that, you translate it as such, but the English text will say it in this way. So it's important to maintain the integrity of the meaning in the given language, and then make the changes as you translate as you go. But I mean, we learned a tremendous amount from our translators as we went as well, because they will have a level of knowledge that also gives us a fresh perspective. But it's generally been quite a positive experience. And we don't get a lot of negative feedback on the translation in the other languages. And we've checked it, and we still do check it. I mean, one of the jobs we did then when the exhibition was open was to get our translation colleagues to come in and read the texts in situ on the tablet and make sure everything was correct. But
thank you, Kieran. It's very, very interesting to hear what a complicated process that was. There's another question, sort of, it's probably the last question I'll take about tablets and technology. It's a very fascinating subject, but we could go into all kinds of detail with it. We've got a question here from Chris Hood, who is saying, have you thought about using augmented reality since you've got tablets in the museum space? This is maybe something that Vicki can speak to as a curator as well, sort of using augmented reality technologies, whether that is part of the plan or has been thought about. Kieran, do you want to just say something briefly about that first?
Yeah, technically, we had enough problems getting a Wi-Fi signal, I think, in the building in the beginning, rather than putting in augmented reality. But I joke. Yes, I think we will use it as we are going increasingly online. But we literally haven't got the technical capacity to use it in galleries, because even a geolocation triggered tablet, which changes as you walk through the institution, implies quite a lot of hardware up there in the ceiling and things like this. So it's quite a lot of work to go into that, and I don't think it's necessarily adaptable to augmented reality. But it is something I think that we're going to explore as we go more online in the light of COVID, where there's a big push now to put more activities online, to put more of a realistic museum experience online. So I guess you could describe that as augmented reality, but it's a little bit beyond us technically in the galleries at the moment.
Thank you. Any thoughts on that, Vicki?
I would echo those thoughts, really. We haven't really got the technical capacity, or actually in some instances the space. There's also some health and safety issues if it was within an actual gallery space, where if somebody has a headset on and they're walking around and they're not able to see the other people and the other exhibits around them. But it is something that we are looking at and thinking about how it can be used potentially, as you said, as something online or in a small exhibition or a travelling show, we recently had a look, and I think you can find examples of it online. It's called the Berlin Blitz, but it was essentially an opportunity for visitors to put on a headset and be inside a bomber with the sound of a original recording on top of the sort of new technology. So it was, we're testing things. It wasn't quite as seamless as it could be, but there are definitely thoughts about how this kind of technology could be used in the future, and I imagine it probably will be.
Thank you very much. So I'm going to sort of try and wrap this up by returning to a couple of questions that we haven't addressed yet, and they both relate to the question of representing colonialism and slavery. So Olivia Obo and Kat Massman have asked questions about, firstly, Olivia's asking whether including reference to African civilization in these museums, but only focusing on colonialism and slavery, is problematic in terms of the narrowness of that representation. And Kat is asking whether there's a danger of representing the problems of colonialism and slavery as being sort of historical ones and not making links to the present. I'm guessing that's something that maybe everyone might have something to say about. Vicki, could we start with you?
Yes, certainly. I would mention here again the sort of community groups and the work that we've been doing there to talk about how the past is relevant to the present, and how what we're displaying in galleries is interesting and able to highlight current issues. We also have, alongside the galleries when they open, there will be sort of a much bigger, wider public programme that IWM will put on that will encourage various different audiences, including school groups, to explore particular issues that are brought up within the galleries. I mean, throughout the entire museum, I think the intention is to provide historical context for current issues. And then we as curators and also other facilitators in the museum are able to sort of encourage those discussions. So that's sort of a general way that I think that we are trying to achieve that.
Thank you. Kieran, how about you?
Yeah, I think they're actually, I can only agree with both questions. I think it is problematic to have representations of Africans only in the context of things like slavery or colonialism. And it's equally important, by the same token, to make the connection with the present day. In relation to the latter, that's very much what we wanted to do in our opening section of the exhibition, was to, not just in relation to slavery and colonialism, but other historical phenomena, to show their relevance to contemporary life in the present. We have a certain structural problem in relation to the first point, i.e. negative representations, because we are primarily a political and a social history museum. And when you look at European history, to an extent, there is a negativity there. And people have said that about the exhibition in general. I mean, one comment we had in the very early days is that Europe is not just Mussolini and Hitler. Europe is Gutenberg. Europe is positive expressions of cultural identity and connection. Why don't you focus on these? In the first instance, it's not the main job of what we do. The main job of what we do is to represent those aspects of we're not such a cultural history museum. But I do think we have a problem, and I do think we need to address issues of more positive representations and also issues of voice, because I think, you know, we have to bring objects and images into the exhibition which avoid the kind of European gaze. And I think naming a problem as in colonialism and delineating it in the first instance has been our first step. But I do think we've got work to do in terms of how we get more subtlety and more nuance and more depth in those representations as we go. And that's about questions of voice and, again, questions of audience engagement. But I think it's important. But the question with the contemporary is also very much relevant to us as well.
Thanks very much, Kieran. Do these issues impact the museums that you're looking at, Eleanor?
Yeah, I would say that they do, although in relation especially to Olivia's question, I think the museum's defence, and again, I don't speak for them at all, but I think their defence would be that they're very much presenting or trying to represent a particular place in a particular time, and that is the Western Front. They're not global First World War museums. They're focusing on these, locations in the Western Front, and they do both have displays and objects that sort of represent encounters between Africans and Europeans during the First World War and the involvement of colonial troops and so on. But I would say that there's not much, if anything, from the point of view of African participants. So it's definitely a problem. It's definitely a bit of a blind spot. And yes, the largest part of representation about Africans is in the context of pre-war colonial violence. So yeah, these are definitely issues. I would mention, and I don't know everything about this topic, but I know that both museums have educational services that that run alongside projects alongside the exhibitions, and they do seem to explore some of these issues with a bit more nuance and subtlety there. So I know that the French Museum, for example, has a cahier, like a workbook, that introduces Africans who participated in the war, and it does give students who are working on these projects information about their lives before and during the war. But these are things that are missing in the permanent exhibitions. So yeah, it's definitely, as Kieran says, it's naming the problem is the first step, but there's definitely work to be done, I think.
Brilliant, thank you very much. I'm just going to hand over to Holly now to make a few sort of summative comments or to raise any other questions before we close.
Thanks, David. Am I muted or unmuted?
We can hear you.
And that was really helpful as well there to finish, Eleanor. I was thinking when you said how radical it was when the museums you were studying opened in the 90s to take this tripartite approach in the Somme Museum, but that could also have some problems of seemingly completeness plus exclusions, that to appear as though it really were just three nations centrally involved, and all of like the enormous African involvement in the First World War. I'm reading about in things like David Olusoga's work, which then might in a way be made less visible, even in the attempt to speak to a more diverse series of perspectives on that war. And I think that sense of omission is something that is obviously a challenge within all the sites. I think that it's been such an interesting conversation about the aspiration to telling transnational stories. And there's been a lot of really frank, thank you, Vicki and Kieran, with your curators hats on, for your great level of frankness and honesty in the things that are more difficult or prove impossible through practical limitations, and also audiences' expectations and just the sheer amount of time they can spend on their feet in the museum, really to get quite a embodied sense of the difficulties you grapple with in this aspiration to tell the more transnational story has been really helpful. And I think I wanted also to thank all the participants today for these really thoughtful set of questions that have led us through both those practical challenges and also the kinds of ethical difficulties you're all facing. Thanks all.
Thank you, Holly, and I would add my thanks not only to our panelists today, but also to our audience and their very thoughtful interactions. It's been a really enlightening and educative experience for all of us, I know, certainly for me. And the recording of this event, as I said, will be available on YouTube very soon for anybody who wants to revisit it or who couldn't be here for all of it. And there will be another event in this series happening very soon in April. We'll be making an announcement about that soon. So I'm going to end the recording here and thank everybody once again. And we
David, can I just one very brief thing before you go?
Yes.
Not to keep you. I haven't been able, I'm not the most tech savvy person, so I haven't been able to type responses to people as they go. I don't know if anybody has further questions, please feel free to talk to David, and David, please feel free to forward my email address to people so we can continue the conversation. But apologies, I can't multitask and answer the questions in time.
It is not easy to do when you've got a Q&A window and a chat and people talking at the same time. It is quite a challenge. But yes, if anybody has any further questions for our panelists and wants to pass them on through me, I'm easy enough to find on the Cardiff University website, then please feel free to do so. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Thank you, David. Thanks all.
Thanks, guys.